Sneaking past a high-tier magic scanner with a fortune of stolen gold is the easy part. To survive in this pathetic, fragile human skin, I must aggressively force my biology past its limits. That means bypassing weak, standard potions and consuming highly restricted, volatile shadow reagents. Even if these toxic materials threaten to completely incinerate my internal organs before I can evolve. The biting wind of the mountain pass whipped violently against my newly acquired, strangely fragile human skin. I was completely unaccustomed to the sheer lack of sensory insulation that my missing draconic scales usually provided. Every gust of freezing air felt like a barrage of tiny icy daggers scraping against my exposed neck. I firmly adjusted the straps of my stolen boiled leather mercenary tunic to block out the chill. Behind me, the massive, reinforced leather sack dug a deep, uncomfortable groove into my human shoulders. The heavy payload contained exactly 5,000 gold coins and 47 uncut wind attribute mana crystals. The sheer physical mass of the combined treasure easily exceeded 100 pounds of dead weight. For my compressed level 40 draconic musculature, carrying this heavy burden was barely a negligible blip on my stamina bar. I could have easily sprinted up a vertical cliff face with this sack without breaking a single sweat. But from a strict agro-management perspective, a scrawny human youth casually jogging with a 100-pound rucksack was a massive red flag. It was practically a neon sign begging for a high-level military inquisitor to pull me aside for a stat check. I needed to manually simulate the exact physical strain of a low-level NPC laborer to maintain my stealth build. I deliberately forced my posture to slump forward, letting my spine curve under the heavy bulk of the leather sack. I manually altered my breathing pattern, forcing ragged, shallow gasps to feign extreme cardiovascular exhaustion. I even dragged my steel-buckled marching boots slightly through the dirt, kicking up small clouds of dust with every sluggish footstep. My performance was flawless, blending perfectly into the miserable reality of a tired traveler seeking refuge. A mile down the rocky incline, the towering stone archway of the Solene Frontier Gates finally loomed into view. The massive fortification was built directly into the jagged walls of the mountain pass, blocking all unauthorized foot traffic. High-walled battlements stretched out on either side of the heavy iron portcullis, bristling with spiked wooden barricades. I could clearly see dozens of heavy ballistae mounted along the upper parapets, all angled downward toward the main road. A long, chaotic queue of ragged merchants, exhausted refugees, and weary mercenaries snaked its way toward the primary checkpoint. I silently joined the absolute back of the crowded line, keeping my head bowed to avoid accidental eye contact. The pungent, overwhelming stench of unwashed human bodies, wet wool, and nervous sweat assaulted my newly formed olfactory senses. I slowly shuffled forward with the massive crowd, using the excruciatingly slow pace to analyze the gate's security layout. Over a dozen heavily armored Solene Vanguard sentries ruthlessly patrolled the edges of the civilian queue. They carried polished steel halberds and wore thick, interlocking plate armor that gleamed with faint defensive enchantments. But the regular infantry guards were completely irrelevant to my current infiltration strategy. My primary concern was the massive, shimmering curtain of violet magical energy cascading directly down from the stone archway. The translucent magical barrier covered the entire entrance of the gate like a thick sheet of cascading, electrified water. Every single person entering the city was strictly forced to walk directly through the shimmering violet curtain. I immediately recognized the advanced detection spell from my extensive gaming experience with high-tier security mechanics. It was a military-grade aurasive, a wide-area passive scanner designed to strip away low-tier illusions and detect monster cores. I subtly activated my gluttonous void eyes to analyze the magical matrix of the shimmering barrier. The violet eyes were now physically hidden completely out of sight beneath a translucent dermal layer beneath my armpits. Despite being concealed under my skin and clothing, they effortlessly projected a perfect 360-degree thermal and magical overlay into my visual cortex. I carefully parsed the scrolling lines of arcane data flowing through the aurasive's internal spell structure. The barrier was heavily calibrated to aggressively flag any biological signature lacking a standard human mana resonance. Fortunately, my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry was not a cheap illusion spell that the gate could easily dispel. It was a fundamental, biological compression of my actual physical DNA, masking my monster core with a flawless human signature. The system had firmly assured me that my disguise was absolute, but the sheer density of the checkpoint's magic still made me deeply paranoid. I consciously suppressed the passive thermal radiation of my volcanic core trait, forcing my internal body temperature down to a normal human level. Just as I finished optimizing my internal stack concealment, a sudden, frantic vibration erupted against my right hip. The heavy, reinforced leather waist pouch securely strapped to my mercenary belt began to violently shake. Inside the cramped darkness of the pouch, my captured level 8 Copperford gopher was having a complete mental breakdown. Squeaks possessed highly attuned sensory instincts specifically evolved for detecting dense concentrations of subterranean minerals and magical energy. The overwhelming ambient radiation of the aura sieve was completely short-circuiting the small rodent's sensitive nervous system. I felt sharp, panicked little claws frantically digging into the thick leather lining of my belt pouch. Squeaks let out a muffled, high-pitched squeal of absolute terror that barely carried over the loud chatter of the crowd. The small pouch physically bulged outward as the desperate rat tried to force his way through the reinforced stitching. If Squeaks managed to rip open the leather and tumble out into the open dirt, my entire stealth run was instantly dead. The heavily armed vanguard sentries would immediately identify him as a monstrous beast and slaughter him on sight. The resulting commotion would inevitably draw a full guard inspection, and they would definitely search my massive sack of contraband. I needed to neutralize Squeak's escalating panic immediately without casting a single visible spell. Any outward manifestation of mana would instantly trigger the aura sieve's localized aggro alarms. I quickly pulled up my companion interface, noting that Squeak's loyalty metric was still hovering at a precarious 42%. The rat was operating entirely on blind, instinctual fear, making it completely unresponsive to my silent, menacing mental commands. I casually let my right hand drop down to my side, resting my palm flat against the wildly vibrating leather pouch. I needed a biological pacifier, something to override the rodent's panic with a surge of positive chemical reinforcement. I instantly routed my focus inward, accessing the vast, categorized biological repository managed by my gourmand's digestion skill. My system automatically archived the molecular makeup of every single organic material I had previously consumed in the marsh. I rapidly scrolled past the toxic fungal spores and highly acidic pitcher plant enzymes in my internal menu. I finally located the exact chemical blueprint for a patch of rare, sweet-tasting moon moss I had eaten weeks ago. The moss possessed natural, highly potent sedative properties that lightly numbed the nervous system when ingested. I precisely activated gourmand's digestion in reverse, channeling the synthesized biological data directly into my right hand. I forcefully commanded the sweat glands located strictly on the tips of my human fingers to heavily overproduce. A thick, highly concentrated drop of sweet, pale blue botanical resin slowly beaded out from the pores of my index finger. The sticky residue carried the intensely sugary, soothing aroma of the original marsh vegetation. I subtly popped the brass button of the leather pouch with my thumb, sliding 2 resin-coated fingers slightly inside the flap. Squeaks blindly snapped at the intruding digits in a blind panic, his sharp incisors grazing my hardened human skin. But the moment the frantic rat tasted the sweet, chemically synthesized botanical resin, his frantic struggling instantly ceased. The highly concentrated sedative properties of the moon moss hit the low-level rodent's bloodstream like a physical hammer. I felt a rough, tiny pink tongue eagerly lapping the sticky residue directly off my fingertips. A small, translucent system notification quietly pinged in the bottom left corner of my peripheral vision. Companion loyalty increased. Copperford gopher. Squeaks. Loyalty has risen from 42% to 49%. Squeaks let out a long, shuddering sigh inside the pouch, the potent sugars completely overriding his magical anxiety. Companion loyalty increased. Copperford gopher. Squeaks. Loyalty has risen from 49% to 55%. The leather pouch finally stopped shaking as the small beast curled into a tight, heavily sedated ball of copper fur. I slowly withdrew my damp fingers from the flap, quickly wiping the remaining sticky residue off on my dark woolen trousers. I quietly secured the brass button on the pouch, successfully avoiding a catastrophic aggro pull from the nearby guards. The long queue of travelers slowly shuffled forward again, bringing me dangerously close to the primary inspection point. I continued my exhausted acting routine, letting out a ragged cough while heavily adjusting the 100-pound sack on my back. The dull, heavy clinking of the 5,000 gold coins grinding against the crystal facets was heavily muffled by the thick leather. To the casual ear, it merely sounded like a massive load of loose iron tools or heavy salvage equipment. We were now only 3 people away from the shimmering violet curtain of the aura sieve. A burly merchant in front of me was currently arguing vehemently with the commanding officer stationed at the barrier. I used the slight delay to run a rapid, comprehensive visual DPS check on the vanguard officer blocking the entrance. The man was noticeably taller than the regular sentries, clad in masterwork steel plate heavily etched with rank insignias. A thick, jagged white scar ran diagonally across his weathered jawline, speaking to years of brutal frontier combat. He held a massive, heavily enchanted silver-tipped halberd resting casually against his broad, armored shoulder. My gluttonous void eyes easily pierced through his physical armor, reading the dense concentration of mana pooling in his chest. The system effortlessly categorized his threat level, quietly identifying him as Guard Captain Vane, level 32. He was a seasoned veteran, completely out-leveling the regular level 15 infantrymen patrolling the perimeter. In my true draconic form, I could have easily snapped this man's spine in half with a single lazy swipe of my tail. But right now, I was firmly locked into a human shell, playing the role of a pathetic, exhausted weakling. Captain Vane aggressively shoved the arguing merchant backward, denying him entry for carrying improperly stamped trade goods. The angry merchant was quickly escorted away by 2 heavily armed pikemen, leaving the path directly open for me. Next in line, Captain Vane barked, his deep, gravelly voice echoing harshly against the stone walls. I shuffled forward on trembling legs, perfectly feigning a state of near-total physical collapse as I stopped before him. I unceremoniously dropped the massive leather sack onto the dirt road, ensuring it landed with a dull, exhausted thud. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my knees while deliberately panting heavily to sell the illusion of profound fatigue. Captain Vane immediately narrowed his cold, steel-gray eyes, his sharp gaze raking over my stolen mercenary attire. He scrutinized the dark woolen trousers and the high-quality boiled leather tunic I had scavenged earlier. "State your business in the Solene frontier, boy," Vane demanded, resting his heavy hand on the shaft of his halberd. "And you better explain why a scrawny kid is dragging around a mercenary haversack big enough to hold a dead body." I wiped a carefully manufactured bead of sweat from my forehead, ensuring my voice trembled with exactly the right amount of residual fear. I'm a baggage handler for the Iron Tusk Mercenary Company, sir," I stammered out, pitching my tone perfectly. I had specifically chosen a generic, highly disposable mercenary company name that would be impossible to immediately verify. We took a contract to clear out a nest of shadow raptors down in the Whispering Ravine 3 days ago. I intentionally referenced the actual geographic location where I had slaughtered Ysteriel's raptors to add verified truth to my lie. The Vanguard scouts regularly patrolled that region, and they would have definitely found the grisly aftermath of my bloody ambush. Vane's rigid posture shifted slightly, recognizing the dangerous location I had just named. "The whole company got wiped out in an ambush," I continued, letting my voice crack with highly convincing, manufactured trauma. "The raptors tore through the Vanguard line in seconds, and the captain told me to take the payroll and run." I gestured weakly toward the massive leather sack resting in the dirt by my heavily scuffed marching boots. "I've been dragging the company's remaining salvage and payroll through the pass for 2 days trying to reach the city." Vane stared at me in absolute silence for several long, agonizing seconds, his veteran instincts actively searching for a flaw in my story. He slowly took a deliberate step forward, his heavy steel boots crunching loudly against the gravel road. A survivor, huh? Vane muttered skeptically, his eyes drifting downward toward the bulging, heavy leather sack. The iron tusks must be completely brain-dead if they trusted their entire payload to a sniveling camp boy. He reached out with a heavily gauntlet hand and firmly gripped the thick, leather drawstrings binding the top of the sack. Let's crack this open and see exactly what kind of payroll you're desperately hauling across my border. A sharp spike of genuine adrenaline instantly flooded my human veins, though I kept my facial expression completely terrified. If Vane opened that sack wide enough, the dense, ambient light of the gateway would immediately reflect off the internal contents. He would instantly see 47 highly restricted, military-grade wind attribute mana crystals mixed in with the Solene Kingdom gold. The crystals were strictly classified as high-level contraband, meant only for state-sanctioned war mages. Smuggling that much raw magical ordnance into a heavily fortified frontier city was a guaranteed execution sentence. I had exactly 3 seconds to permanently derail his impending visual inspection without triggering a violent physical altercation. I instantly lunged forward with a desperate, panicked expression, aggressively grabbing the thick leather rim of the bag. "Please, sir, don't spill it," I cried out, my voice shrill and perfectly attuned to the frequency of a desperate coward. I intentionally scraped the back of my hand against the jagged iron buckle of my own mercenary belt during the rapid motion. The sharp metal easily sliced through my fragile human epidermis, drawing a thin, bright red line of genuine blood. The sudden scent of fresh, metallic human blood slightly distracted Vane, making him pause his immediate pulling motion. I used that exact microscopic window of distraction to plunge my right hand directly into the tight neck of the leather sack. My highly sensitized fingers instantly plunged into the cool, densely packed layer of 5,000 gold coins. I rapidly used my tactile feedback to isolate and grip exactly 5 heavy gold coins from the top of the massive pile. I needed to execute a flawless sleight-of-hand transfer, but there was a massive physiological risk attached to my current adrenaline spike. Under high emotional stress, my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry could occasionally glitch, automatically deploying my defensive monster traits. If I wasn't incredibly careful, my deadly Void Claw ability would instinctively manifest, transforming my human fingers into obsidian talons. Flashing razor-sharp draconic claws directly in front of a level 32 Vanguard captain would instantly initiate a fatal boss fight. I furiously clamped down on my primal instincts, heavily suppressing the surging mana trying to pool in my nail beds. I forced my skin to remain perfectly soft, pliable, and flawlessly human as I maintained a tight grip on the currency. I swiftly pulled my bloodied right hand out of the tight leather opening, keeping my palm carefully angled downward. I deliberately stumbled forward, pretending that my exhausted legs had suddenly given out under the emotional stress. I crashed heavily against Captain Vane's thick steel breastplate, desperately reaching out to grab his gauntlet hand for balance. "Please, Captain," I whispered frantically, ensuring my tone was low enough that the nearby guards couldn't hear the transaction. "The company master will literally flame me alive if I don't deliver the full payload to the guild registry." During the clumsy, chaotic physical contact, I smoothly slid the 5 heavy gold coins directly into his armored palm. My suppressed fingers flawlessly executed the hidden transfer, moving with the rapid, untraceable blur of a high-level rogue. Vane's heavy fingers twitched slightly as he felt the undeniable, heavy weight of pure Solene gold pressing into his gauntlet. 5 gold coins was an absolutely astronomical sum for a frontier border guard, easily equating to 3 full months of hazardous duty pay. I slowly pushed myself back from his chest, leaving the massive bribe securely hidden within his closed fist. I kept my eyes locked firmly on the dirt, completely submitting to his overwhelming authority while heavily favoring my supposedly injured hand. Vane remained perfectly motionless for a long, heavy moment, his veteran mind rapidly calculating the risk-to-reward ratio. He smoothly lowered his hand, silently sliding the 5 gold coins into a hidden compartment on his heavily plated belt. The clinking of the coins was entirely masked by the loud, chaotic rattling of a passing merchant's wooden cart. The rigid, aggressive tension bleeding from his broad shoulders instantly confirmed that the transaction was successful. Vane casually stepped back, aggressively kicking the heavy leather sack with the toe of his steel boot. "You iron-tusk rats are all the same," Vane sneered loudly, projecting his voice so the other guards could hear his official verdict. "Pathetic, disorganized, and barely capable of hauling your own garbage back from the wilderness." He dramatically waved his gauntlet hand toward the massive, shimmering violet curtain of the aura sieve. "Get this heavy trash out of my line before I throw you in the holding cells for loitering, boy." "Thank you, sir. Thank you." I groveled enthusiastically, repeatedly bowing my head like a truly grateful, pathetic civilian. I reached down and grabbed the thick straps of the heavy leather sack, groaning loudly as I hauled it back onto my shoulders. I adjusted the weight carefully, ensuring the remaining 4,995 gold coins and the deadly contraband crystals remained securely muffled. I turned my back to the heavily armed captain and limped directly toward the massive, electrified magical barrier. As my physical human body crossed the threshold, the dense violet magic of the aura sieve aggressively washed over my skin. It felt like walking through a heavy curtain of freezing static electricity, making the tiny hairs on my human arms stand straight up. The spell deeply probed my biological signature, actively hunting for the dense, chaotic mana core of a catastrophe-rank monster. It violently scraped against the heavily compressed layers of my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry, searching for a flaw in the genetic masking. But the biological disguise was absolute, presenting nothing but a mundane, exhausted human profile to the magical scanner. The shimmering violet barrier flashed a soft, approving blue, signaling that a perfectly normal civilian had just entered the city. I let out a slow, deeply controlled breath as I successfully cleared the formidable magical checkpoint without triggering a single alarm. I stepped off the heavily guarded inspection platform and officially merged into the bustling, chaotic streets of the Soline frontier. The massive wooden doors of the inner gate heavily slammed shut behind me, completely separating me from the wilderness. I casually patted the leather pouch on my waist, feeling Squeaks snoring peacefully in his heavily sedated, sugar-induced coma. The heavy bag of immense wealth dug comfortably into my back, providing a massive pool of resources for my upcoming gear upgrades. I dropped the pathetic, exhausted slouch from my posture, finally standing up straight with the terrifying confidence of an apex predator. My gluttonous void eyes quietly tracked the dense flow of human traffic, actively mapping the winding streets of my new hunting ground. The pristine, heavily defended human stronghold was completely unaware of the absolute monster that had just walked through their front door. I smiled slightly, letting my sharp, pristine human teeth flash in the dim light of the frontier alleyways as I began my next grind. The cobblestone streets of the Soline frontier's outer ring were a chaotic, sprawling maze of haphazardly constructed stone buildings and narrow, winding alleyways. Thick plumes of gray soot continuously poured from dozens of massive industrial forge chimneys, coating the surrounding rooftops in a permanent layer of dark grime. The ambient noise was absolutely deafening, a relentless cacophony of ringing blacksmith hammers, shouting street vendors, and the heavy clatter of armored merchant caravans. I casually adjusted the heavy leather sack on my back, ensuring the massive payload of raw wealth was perfectly balanced against my disguised spine. My gluttonous void eyes, still safely concealed beneath my dermal layer, effortlessly projected a dense thermal overlay of the crowded street directly into my mind. I could clearly see the glowing biological heat signatures of thousands of humans moving around me like a massive, disorganized colony of colorful insects. Most of the civilians registered as dull, low-level blue wisps of energy, indicating they possessed absolutely zero combat training or magical aptitude. Occasionally, a bright yellow or aggressive orange thermal signature would push through the crowd, identifying a mid-tier mercenary or a heavily armed city guard. I fluidly wove my way through the dense crush of unwashed bodies, consciously suppressing my natural draconic urge to violently shoulder-check the weaker humans out of my path. Playing a low-profile stealth build required a massive amount of psychological restraint, especially when every instinct demanded I assert absolute territorial dominance. Suddenly, my 360-degree thermal vision detected a small, rapid fluctuation in the ambient heat signatures directly behind my right hip. A scrawny, trembling red heat signature was expertly weaving through the blind spots of the crowd, matching my walking pace with suspicious precision. The system's passive identification UI quickly highlighted the stealthy pursuer, tagging him as a level 4 street cut purse. The ambitious little thief was completely fixated on the brass-buttoned leather pouch strapped to my mercenary belt. He clearly thought it was a careless traveler's unprotected coin purse, completely unaware that it currently housed a highly sedated monster. I maintained my casual, forward-facing stride, not giving the low-level rogue a single visual indicator that his stealth approach had been completely compromised. I waited exactly 3 seconds, allowing the cut purse to close the final distance and extend his filthy, trembling fingers toward the brass button. Just as his dirty fingernails brushed against the leather, I flawlessly executed a microscopic, highly calculated shift of my right hip. I sharply twisted my torso a fraction of an inch, perfectly aligning the jagged steel buckle of my heavy mercenary belt with the trajectory of his incoming hand. The level 4 thief blindly jammed his fingers directly into the unforgiving metal edge with the full, unmitigated momentum of his own forward lunge. A muffled, agonizing gasp of pure pain erupted from behind me as the sharp steel deeply bruised his fragile human knuckles. I casually kept walking without missing a single step, perfectly blending back into the heavy flow of the merchant traffic as if nothing had happened. My thermal overlay watched the bright red signature of the cut purse rapidly retreat into a dark alley, frantically clutching his heavily injured hand. It was a perfectly executed, zero-aggro physical counter that didn't generate a single blip of magical energy to alert the city guards. I gently tapped the outside of the leather pouch with my index finger, confirming that Squeaks was still deeply immobilized by the moon moss sedative. The level 8 copper-furred gopher let out a soft, highly muted snore, completely oblivious to the attempted robbery that had just occurred. But the potent botanical resin wouldn't keep the high-strung Orrat chemically pacified forever, and I desperately needed a secure location before he woke up. A panicked, rampaging subterranean monster in the middle of a crowded city street would instantly ruin my carefully cultivated disguise. I actively shifted my gaze away from the pristine, heavily patrolled main thoroughfare and deliberately turned down a dimly lit, foul-smelling side street. This was the city's underbelly, a neglected district heavily populated by unregistered scavengers, desperate bounty hunters, and gray market traders. The towering stone architecture quickly gave way to rotting wooden tenements and heavily fortified cellar doors guarded by suspicious-looking thugs. I scanned the peeling wooden signs hanging above the various establishments until I spotted a rusted iron plaque depicting a shattered anvil. The building beneath the sign was a massive, 3-story tavern constructed from thick, dark oak and heavily reinforced with blackened iron brackets. The heavy wooden door was deeply scarred by dozens of old sword strikes and superficial fire spells, an undeniable testament to the establishment's violent clientele. It was exactly the kind of high-risk, low-security establishment where a heavily armed mercenary could rent a room with absolute anonymity. I pushed open the heavy tavern door, immediately stepping into a massive, dimly lit common room thick with the pungent stench of stale ale and pipe smoke. Over 50 hardened mercenaries and rogue spellcasters were crowded around heavily stained wooden tables, aggressively gambling and drinking from massive iron tankards. The sudden influx of fresh air from the open door caused several heavily scarred veterans to instinctively drop their hands to the pommels of their concealed daggers. I completely ignored their aggressive posturing, maintaining a perfectly bored, emotionless expression as I walked directly toward the main bar. My heavy, mud-caked boots thudded loudly against the sticky wooden floorboards, signaling my absolute confidence in this hostile environment. The innkeeper standing behind the bar was a massive, heavily muscled man with a completely bald head and a thick, braided black beard. The system quietly identified him as a level 14 retired heavy brawler, his massive forearms covered in faded magical protection tattoos. He aggressively slammed a dirty rag onto the sticky wooden counter, crossing his massive arms as he glared down at my scrawny human disguise. "We don't serve unescorted camp boys in the shattered Anvil," the towering innkeeper growled, his deep voice easily cutting through the ambient noise of the tavern. "Get back out on the street before one of my regulars decides to use your ribcage as a weapon rack." I didn't say a single word in response to his incredibly generic, low-level NPC intimidation tactic. Instead, I smoothly reached into the tight neck of my heavy leather sack, my fingers instantly finding the cold, dense layer of Soline gold coins. I pulled a single heavy gold coin from the pile and aggressively slammed it directly onto the center of the wooden bar. The sharp, heavy metallic clink of pure gold instantly silenced the immediate vicinity, drawing greedy stares from several nearby tables. A single gold coin was an absolutely astronomical overpayment for a rotting tavern room, easily covering a full week of premium lodging and hot meals. The innkeeper's aggressive glare instantly evaporated, his wide eyes completely fixated on the royal crest stamped into the gleaming metal surface. "I need your most secure room on the top floor, far away from the street noise," I demanded, lowering my voice into a chilling, deadpan register. "I need a heavy iron lock on the door, no room service, and absolutely zero questions about what I do inside." The massive brawler rapidly blinked, his deeply ingrained merchant instincts instantly overriding his previous hostility. He swiftly slammed his massive hand down over the gold coin, effortlessly sweeping it off the counter and into his heavily stained leather apron. "Room 7, 3rd floor, all the way at the end of the hall," the innkeeper rapidly replied, sliding a heavy brass key across the sticky counter. "The door is reinforced with banded iron, and the floorboards are thick enough to muffle a moderate explosion." I snatched the heavy brass key off the bar with a fluid, untraceable motion, firmly clutching the cold metal in my palm. "Perfect," I muttered, immediately turning my back on the bartender and heading directly for the dark, highly unstable-looking wooden staircase. I could feel the intense, burning gazes of several low-level rogues tracking my heavy leather sack as I climbed the creaking steps. Let them look. If any of these pathetic, drunken humans actually tried to breach my room tonight, I would eagerly welcome the free experience points. I bypassed the crowded 2nd floor entirely, continuing up the narrow, winding stairwell until I reached the significantly quieter 3rd floor landing. The hallway was completely dark, illuminated only by a single, flickering magical luminor permanently affixed to the cracked plaster ceiling. I walked silently to the very end of the long corridor, stopping in front of a heavy, iron-banded oak door bearing a scratched number 7. I slid the brass key into the rusted iron lock, feeling the heavy internal tumblers stubbornly grind against each other before finally clicking open. I pushed the heavy door inward and immediately stepped into the cramped, incredibly dusty confines of my newly acquired safe house. The room was extremely Spartan, containing only a lumpy, straw-stuffed mattress, a rotting wooden desk, and a heavily tarnished brass washbasin. A single, narrow window covered by thick iron grates looked out over the smog-choked, perpetually dark alleyway behind the tavern. I immediately kicked the heavy oak door shut behind me, loudly sliding the massive internal iron deadbolt securely into place. For an added layer of physical security, I casually walked over to the massive, solid oak desk resting against the far wall. A normal human with my apparent scrawny physique would have needed to violently drag the heavy furniture across the room, making a massive amount of noise. I simply clamped my right hand onto the thick wooden edge, effortlessly engaging a microscopic fraction of my compressed level 40 draconic strength. I silently lifted the entire 500-pound desk 3 inches off the floor with a single hand, completely bypassing the friction of the floorboards. I gently set the massive wooden barricade directly flush against the locked door, ensuring it didn't make a single audible sound during the placement. With the perimeter completely secured, I finally let out a long, deeply satisfying sigh, allowing the rigid, exhausted tension to fully leave my simulated human muscles. I unceremoniously unbuckled the heavy leather straps of my massive rucksack, letting the 100-pound burden drop heavily onto the center of the straw mattress. I popped the thick leather drawstrings wide open, finally exposing the massive, glittering payload to the dim light of the room. Exactly 4,994 gold coins spilled out in a magnificent, heavy cascade, forming a shimmering mountain of pure, concentrated capital. Buried deep within the massive pile of mundane currency were the 47 uncut, highly restricted wind attribute mana crystals. The jagged, asymmetrical gemstones pulsed with a faint, hypnotic emerald light, passively radiating a cool, refreshing breeze into the stale air of the room. I gently ran my human fingers through the dense pile of loot, reveling in the highly satisfying tactile sensation of overwhelming wealth. This massive hoard of gold and rare magical ordnance was the absolute foundation of my upcoming progression path. I needed to meticulously convert this raw capital into highly specialized, magically enchanted gear that could easily withstand my aggressive combat style. Standard human steel would instantly melt into useless slag the second I actively channeled the intense thermal radiation of my volcanic core trait. I needed to locate a high-tier, morally flexible blacksmith capable of forging enchanted mithril or deep-earth tungsten without asking annoying questions. Before I could fully map out my intricate shopping list, a sudden violent twitch erupted from the small leather pouch on my belt. The potent, sugar-laced sedative properties of the moon moss were finally beginning to wear off, and Squeaks was rapidly waking up. I quickly unfastened the brass button and reached 2 fingers inside, gently pinching the scruff of the level 8 copper-furred gopher's neck. I smoothly pulled the heavily disoriented rodent out of the cramped pouch and deposited him directly onto the wooden desk. Squeaks wobbled unsteadily on his 4 tiny paws, his large, sensitive ears twitching erratically as he tried to visually process his new environment. He let out a confused, high-pitched chirp, his small pink nose aggressively sniffing the unfamiliar, stale scent of the tavern room. I pulled up his status screen with a quick mental command, confirming that his loyalty metric was still securely locked at 55%. The massive spike of terror he had experienced at the Orisiv checkpoint hadn't permanently damaged our fragile, mutually beneficial relationship. To preemptively stall any lingering anxiety, I quickly activated my gourmand's digestion skill, accessing my internal biological archive once again. I synthesized another heavily concentrated drop of sweet, blue botanical resin directly onto the tip of my right index finger. Squeak's large, black eyes instantly dilated at the familiar, highly addictive sugary aroma filling the immediate space. The small rodent practically launched himself forward, eagerly wrapping his tiny paws around my finger as his rough tongue went to work on the resin. The system chimed softly in the background, a small translucent notification confirming that my companion management was optimal. Companion loyalty increased. Copper-furred gopher, Squeaks, loyalty has risen from 55% to 57%. Drink up, you pathetic little radar dish, I muttered softly, watching the small monster gorge himself on the synthesized sugars. I'm going to need your highly specialized subterranean sensory organs functioning at absolute peak capacity tomorrow. Squeaks was completely invaluable for navigating the complex, mineral-dense layout of the deeper frontier dungeons I planned to ruthlessly exploit. While the rodent pacified himself, I turned my full attention back to the massive pile of gold and wind attribute crystals resting on the bed. I needed a highly durable storage solution to transport this wealth through the city without actively carrying a massive, suspicious leather sack everywhere. Unfortunately, the system hadn't miraculously gifted me a spatial storage ring, meaning I was still entirely bound by the annoying laws of physical mass. I meticulously began sorting the 4,994 gold coins into tightly bound, heavily compressed cylindrical stacks using strips of torn cloth from my bedroll. I packed the heavy coin rolls evenly throughout the various hidden compartments of my hardened boiled leather mercenary tunic. Distributing the intense physical weight across my entire torso completely neutralized the suspicious, localized bulge of the massive rucksack. Next, I carefully wrapped the 47 highly illegal wind attribute mana crystals in a thick layer of damp wool to perfectly suppress their passive magical radiation. I secured the heavy bundle of wrapped crystals tightly against the small of my back, burying it deeply beneath my heavy leather belt and outer cloak. It was a tedious, highly manual process, but flawlessly adhering to the strict rules of mundane physical concealment was what kept me alive. Once the final crystal was secured, I stood perfectly still, closing my eyes to run a comprehensive, full-body internal diagnostic. The oppressive weight of the distributed loot pressed heavily against my fragile human skin, but my draconic skeletal structure easily absorbed the burden. My Tier 1 humanoid mimicry was holding perfectly stable, maintaining my mundane biological signature without a single microscopic fluctuation in mana. I was completely undetectable, heavily armed with overwhelming capital, and perfectly positioned directly inside the enemy's heavily fortified stronghold. I silently gripped the thick edge of the massive oak desk currently barricading my tavern door, carefully engaging a microscopic fraction of my compressed level 40 strength. I lifted the 500-pound furniture an inch off the floorboards. I smoothly set the heavy desk back into its original position against the far wall without generating a single audible scrape. I reached for the heavy iron deadbolt, slowly pulling the thick metal cylinder back to avoid making a loud, echoing clack. Opening the iron-banded door just enough to squeeze my human frame through, I slipped out into the dimly lit third-floor hallway. I slid my brass key into the rusted lock, securing the empty room to maintain the illusion that I was still inside sleeping. I descended the highly unstable wooden staircase, deliberately placing my heavy leather marching boots directly over the internal support beams. This calculated movement completely negated the agonizing creaks and groans that the rotting wooden stairs naturally produced under physical pressure. Bypassing the violently noisy common room of the shattered anvil entirely, I slipped out a narrow side exit into the freezing night air. The squalid lower ward immediately assaulted my newly formed human senses with a chaotic, overwhelming barrage of horrific stimuli. The cobblestone streets were heavily slicked with a foul-smelling mixture of overflowing sewage, discarded industrial grease, and frozen mud. Thick, suffocating plumes of gray smog continuously rolled through the narrow alleyways, heavily restricting natural visibility to less than 30 feet. It was a massive environmental debuff that effectively blinded standard human guards, creating the perfect sandbox for high-level rogue builds. I casually adjusted my stolen boiled leather mercenary tunic, ensuring the tightly bound rolls of 4,994 gold coins were sitting flush against my torso. The distributed weight pressed heavily against my ribs, serving as a constant, comforting reminder of my immense liquid capital. Beneath the heavy folds of my dark outer cloak, the damp wool bundle containing my 47 wind attribute mana crystals rested securely against my lower back. I tapped the reinforced leather pouch hanging from my steel-buckled belt, feeling the faint, rhythmic breathing of my heavily sedated companion. Squeaks was still deeply immobilized by the sugary moonmoss resin, his loyalty metric holding perfectly stable at 57%. I mentally commanded the gluttonous void eyes physically concealed beneath the translucent dermal layer of my armpits to activate their passive scanning functions. A flawless, 360-degree thermal and magical overlay instantly flooded my visual cortex, aggressively painting the dark, smog-choked street in vibrant data. The system's intricate UI effortlessly tracked the ambient heat signatures of dozens of low-level civilians huddled around burning trash barrels in the distance. I seamlessly merged into the sparse, late-night pedestrian traffic, manually mimicking the slow, exhausted pathing of a depressed, off-duty laborer. My immediate objective was entirely logistical. I needed to rapidly liquidate a massive portion of my highly illegal magical ordnance into usable currency. Carrying 47 military-grade wind crystals was the equivalent of hauling unexploded siege munitions through a heavily fortified military checkpoint. If a high-level inquisitor randomly targeted me for an advanced search, the sheer density of the raw elemental mana would instantly guarantee my execution. I needed a black market fence, someone with enough localized liquid capital to buy me out and enough inherent corruption to ignore the law. Standard merchant guild storefronts were completely useless to me, as their transactions were heavily monitored by the Soline Vanguard's strict taxation wards. I aggressively filtered my void eyes scanning parameters, specifically tuning the visual matrix to hunt for illicit, unregistered magical signatures. I walked deeper into the labyrinthine slums, analyzing the faint, localized magical auras radiating off the various reinforced wooden storefronts. Most of the buildings emitted the dull, standard blue glow of cheap preservation spells used to keep spoiled meat and stale bread marginally edible. After 15 minutes of meticulous, zero-aggro navigation, my sweeping thermal vision caught a massive, highly suspicious anomaly down a dead-end alley. The building was a narrow, heavily dilapidated stone structure wedged tightly between two towering, completely abandoned brick warehouses. There was no hanging wooden sign, no welcoming lumen orb, and absolutely no physical indication that it was an active place of business. However, to my highly tuned void eyes, the unassuming stone facade was absolutely screaming with layers of complex, expensive magical encryption. The heavy oak door was internally lined with a dense mesh of lead and enchanted silver wire, creating a localized mana-dampening field. It was a highly illegal, military-grade privacy ward specifically designed to actively deflect the Soline Vanguard's passive scrying attempts. Only an extremely successful, deeply paranoid criminal element would invest that much raw capital into defending a literal pile of garbage. I casually altered my trajectory, leaving the main thoroughfare and stepping into the suffocating darkness of the narrow, trash-filled alleyway. My heavy marching boots crushed a discarded glass bottle, the sharp crunch echoing loudly against the damp, mold-covered brick walls. I stopped directly in front of the heavily warded oak door, running a rapid diagnostic check on my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry. My compressed level 40 stats were perfectly hidden behind the mundane, completely harmless biological signature of a scrawny teenage mercenary. I raised my human fist and aggressively knocked on the thick wood, deliberately using the erratic, impatient rhythm of an anxious looter. For several long, agonizing seconds, the dark alley remained completely silent, save for the distant, muffled shouting of a drunken brawl. Then, a tiny, concealed sliding panel built directly into the center of the oak door scraped open with a harsh metallic screech. A single, bloodshot human I peered out from the narrow rectangular slit, glaring at my soaked leather tunic and unkempt dark hair. "The apothecary is closed, boy," a raspy, heavily irritated voice hissed through the thick iron grate covering the viewing slot. "Come back at dawn." I didn't waste a single syllable on standard, low-level NPC pleasantries, opting instead to immediately exploit his inherent, greedy nature. I reached around to my lower back, slipping a single finger past the damp wool wrappings to forcefully extract one jagged wind attribute mana crystal. I held the uncut, faintly pulsing emerald gemstone directly up to the narrow viewing slot, ensuring the ambient magical light illuminated his bloodshot eye. "I didn't come here to buy overpriced headache powder," I said, pitching my voice into a low, deadpan register perfectly suited for a legal trade. The bloodshot eye instantly widened, the pupil dilating massively as it locked onto the undeniable glow of the highly restricted military ordnance. The metal viewing panel slammed violently shut, followed immediately by the heavy, mechanical grinding of at least 3 internal steel deadbolts retracting. The massive oak door slowly swung inward, revealing a cramped, dimly lit interior that smelled heavily of stale incense and ozone. I stepped over the rusted iron threshold, my highly attuned senses instantly categorizing the dense array of stolen merchandise cluttering the shop. The walls were lined with sagging wooden shelves groaning under the weight of unregistered alchemy supplies, tarnished silver goblets, and blood-stained weaponry. Standing behind a heavily reinforced, iron-caged counter was the man who had answered the door, his physical appearance practically radiating untrustworthiness. He was an incredibly gaunt, rat-faced human with thinning, heavily greased black hair tightly slicked back against his narrow skull. Despite his squalid surroundings, he wore a highly expensive, dark silk doublet trimmed with genuine silver thread beneath a heavily stained leather apron. A delicate, gold-rimmed jeweler's monocle was firmly wedged over his right eye, pulsing with a faint, localized mana magnification enchantment. My system's passive identification UI instantly locked onto his thermal signature, quietly tagging him as Kalen the Smuggler, level 18 black market fence. He was completely pathetic in terms of raw physical DPS, but his extensive network and specialized appraisal skills made him highly dangerous in a social encounter. Kalen aggressively locked the massive oak door behind me, engaging an extra magical ward that effectively sealed the room from the outside world. You have exactly 10 seconds to explain how a filthy camp boy got his hands on Vanguard artillery core materials, Kalen demanded, crossing his thin arms. He was actively trying to establish immediate psychological dominance, utilizing his higher social standing to intimidate a supposedly lower-level supplier. I internally scoffed at his pathetic attempt at merchant agro-management, perfectly maintaining my emotionless, exhausted mercenary persona. I walked directly up to the iron-caged counter and casually tossed the single, pulsing emerald wind crystal through the narrow transaction slot. The heavy gemstone clattered loudly against the scarred wooden surface of the counter, coming to rest mere inches from Kalen's twitching fingers. My former company intercepted a Soline supply carriage in the Whispering Ravine. I lied flawlessly, seamlessly re-using the cover story I gave Captain Vane. The company got wiped out by shadow raptors, and I managed to scavenge a portion of the payload before fleeing into the pass. Kalen's greedy eyes never left the glowing gemstone as he slowly reached out, his thin fingers trembling slightly with barely contained excitement. He picked up the jagged crystal, bringing it directly up to his enchanted monocle to meticulously inspect the internal elemental matrix. "It's heavily flawed," Kalen lied effortlessly, his raspy voice dripping with practiced, condescending dismissal. "The internal mana lattice is completely fractured from improper extraction." I watched his thermal signature closely, noting the microscopic, involuntary spike in his heart rate that completely betrayed his spoken words. The crystal was absolutely flawless, heavily saturated with high-density wind mana that was practically begging to be weaponized into an area of effect spell. "I can barely classify this as low-grade quartz," Kalen continued, dramatically sighing as he set the priceless gemstone back onto the wooden counter. "It's highly volatile, illegal to possess, and practically worthless to any reputable artisan operating within the city walls." He leaned slightly forward against the iron cage, a predatory, mocking smirk slowly spreading across his thin, rat-like features. "However, out of the goodness of my heart, I'm willing to take this massive legal liability off your hands for a flat fee of 2 gold coins." A wave of profound, analytical disgust washed over my internal gamer logic as I rapidly processed the sheer audacity of his lowball offer. 2 gold coins was less than the cost of a standard iron broadsword at a reputable blacksmith, completely ignoring the item's true intrinsic value. A flawless wind attribute mana crystal of this specific density routinely sold on the regulated market for at least 200 gold coins. Even accounting for the standard 50% black market markdown to wash the illicit origins, the crystal was objectively worth 100 gold. Kalen was aggressively trying to secure a 98% profit margin by actively exploiting what he assumed was my desperate, uneducated ignorance. I didn't immediately react to his insulting offer, instead keeping my human face perfectly blank as I subtly shifted my physical posture. I routed a tiny surge of localized mana directly into the gluttonous void eyes physically concealed beneath my armpits, boosting their penetrative scanning power. I completely ignored Kalen's physical form, directing my heavily augmented thermal and magical vision directly through the thick wooden surface of his transaction counter. The heavily enchanted oak desk instantly turned translucent in my visual cortex, allowing me to view the hidden mechanical structures concealed within. Directly beneath the primary cash drawer, heavily shielded by a dense layer of lead, was a secret, spring-loaded compartment containing a thick leather book. The pages of the hidden book were heavily saturated with a highly specific, magically reactive ink designed to be completely invisible to the naked eye. My void eyes effortlessly decoded the complex arcane cipher, directly translating the dense ledgers of Kalen's highly illegal, completely unregistered transactions. I rapidly scanned the glowing green text, aggressively memorizing the specific names, dates, and exact quantities of his most damning recent operations. I saw heavily documented imports of restricted wyvern venom, massive tax evasions involving imperial silk, and several direct bribes paid to Vanguard lieutenants. Kalen wasn't just a low-level fence. He was a massive, highly vulnerable logistical nexus for the entire squalid lower ward's criminal infrastructure. Armed with this highly volatile blackmail material, I finally ended the prolonged silence, my voice dropping into a chillingly calm, calculated tone. 2 gold coins is a remarkably ungenerous appraisal, Kalen, I stated flatly, deliberately using his actual name to shatter his illusion of anonymity. The smuggler flinched violently, his predatory smirk instantly vanishing as he defensively stepped back from the iron-caged counter. "How do you know my name, boy?" Kalen demanded, his raspy voice suddenly tight with genuine, rapidly escalating paranoia. "I know significantly more than just your name," I replied, leaning my human frame casually against the rusted iron bars separating us. "For instance, I know that 3 days ago, you processed exactly 14 vials of restricted wyvern venom for a mercenary named Thorn." Kalen's physical thermal signature instantly spiked with massive, terrified heat, his entire body going completely rigid at the mention of the highly illegal transaction. "I also know you actively evaded the Vanguard's taxation wards on a shipment of 400 yards of Imperial silk last Tuesday," I continued smoothly. I casually reached back beneath my dark cloak, firmly gripping the damp wool bundle containing the remaining massive stockpile of my contraband. "And I know that if the Soline Vanguard Inquisitors somehow gained access to the hidden, lead-lined ledger completely concealed beneath your cash drawer, you would hang." Kalen's face drained of all natural color, his sallow skin taking on the horrifying, pale complexion of a freshly animated corpse. He instinctively slammed his thin hands down onto the wooden counter directly over the hidden compartment, his chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. "Your Vanguard intelligence," Kalen hissed venomously, his right hand slowly creeping toward a heavily enchanted dagger hidden beneath his leather apron. "You're a damned rat. If I were Vanguard intelligence, there would currently be a heavily armed strike team completely dismantling your reinforced oak door," I pointed out pragmatically. I aggressively pulled the heavy wool bundle out from beneath my cloak, slamming it violently onto the counter right next to the single-wind crystal. I swiftly untied the thick leather binding, letting the damp wool fall away to completely expose 39 more flawlessly cut, highly unstable emerald gemstones. The combined ambient magical radiation of the 40 wind crystals instantly illuminated the dark, cramped pawnshop in a blinding, aggressive green light. Kalen practically choked on his own saliva, his bloodshot eyes bulging so far out of his skull they threatened to pop the enchanted monocle. "By the gods," Kalen whispered hoarsely, his hand completely abandoning his hidden dagger as he stared at the absolutely staggering pile of raw military wealth. "That's enough concentrated wind mana to completely level the entire upper keep. Where did you actually get this? The origin of my inventory is completely irrelevant to our current transaction," I stated coldly, ruthlessly maintaining my absolute control over the negotiation. I still had exactly 7 wind crystals safely sequestered in the small of my back, ensuring I maintained a personal stockpile for my volcanic core combustions. I specifically needed to liquidate exactly 40 crystals to generate the massive liquid capital required for my upcoming, highly expensive gear upgrades. "I require exactly 4,000 gold coins for these 40 crystals," I demanded, setting the price at a highly firm, non-negotiable 100 gold each. It was the exact, calculated 50% black market markdown value, ensuring he still made a massive profit while I completely bypassed the legal risk. Kalen aggressively shook his head, his deeply ingrained merchant greed desperately fighting against the overwhelming terror of my blackmail material. 4,000 gold? Kalen scoffed, his raspy voice cracking under the intense psychological pressure. "That's completely absurd, boy. Do you have any idea how much physical space 4,000 gold coins takes up? It weighs nearly 100 pounds. I already knew exactly how heavy that much currency was, considering I currently had nearly 5,000 gold coins physically strapped to my chest. I don't keep that kind of heavy, low-density currency on hand," Kalen continued to argue, desperately trying to regain his footing in the negotiation. "And even if I did, I refused to be aggressively extorted by some scrawny, jumped-up camp rat who stumbled onto a lucky scavenger drop. The smuggler aggressively slammed his hand onto a small, highly polished brass bell physically bolted to the underside of his transaction counter. A loud, sharp chime echoed through the shop, completely bypassing the localized privacy wards and echoing deep into the back storage rooms. "I have 2 heavily augmented enforcers in the back room," Kalen sneered, a desperate, ugly confidence temporarily returning to his rat-like face. "They're going to break both of your legs, throw your bleeding carcass into the sewer, and I'm going to take these crystals for absolutely nothing." I let out a long, deeply exaggerated sigh, completely disappointed that the low-level NPC had chosen the absolute worst possible dialogue option. I didn't have the time or the patience to engage in a messy, highly destructive physical brawl inside a confined, heavily warded space. If I was forced to violently slaughter his enforcers, I would completely destroy my only viable avenue for liquidating my highly illegal magical ordnance. I needed Kalen completely alive, highly compliant, and absolutely terrified of ever crossing me again. It was time to aggressively bypass his pathetic social armor by weaponizing the absolute horror of my true, uncompressed biological nature. I locked my human eyes directly onto his terrified gaze and intentionally relaxed the absolute, ironclad control over my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry. I didn't drop the disguise entirely. Doing so would instantly cause my massive, heavily scaled draconic form to violently explode out of my human skin. Instead, I carefully dialed back the intense biological compression by exactly 1%, just enough to let my true monster aura slightly bleed through. The effect on the confined, heavily stale air of the tiny pawnshop was absolutely immediate and completely catastrophic. The ambient temperature of the room violently plummeted, the sudden lack of thermal energy causing rapid condensation to physically frost the glass counter. The heavy, invisible presence of a catastrophe-rank ancient marsh hydro-tyrant suddenly manifested within the tiny, claustrophobic space. It was a suffocating, predatory pressure, the exact physical sensation of being helplessly trapped underwater in the jaws of an apex predator. The 40 glowing wind crystals aggressively flickered, their internal mana matrices violently reacting to the overwhelming suppression of my leaked aura. I leaned my human face slightly closer to the iron grate, deliberately allowing a faint, horrifying violet light to bleed into my mundane brown eyes. "Cancel the enforcers," I whispered, my voice heavily distorted, carrying the faint, terrifyingly deep resonance of grinding tectonic plates. Kalen's physical response to the microdose of draconic terror was absolutely instantaneous and completely pitiful. His knees violently buckled under the immense, crushing spiritual pressure, causing him to instantly collapse backward against his wooden shelving units. A terrified, high-pitched gasp tore itself from his throat as he desperately clutched at his own chest, his heart violently hammering against his ribs. The heavily enchanted gold monocle wedged firmly over his right, I let out a sharp, audible crack as the glass physically shattered. The delicate arcane matrix of the appraisal tool had completely overloaded trying to actively measure the catastrophic density of my leaked mana aura. "Stop! Please! Stop!" Kalen openly wept, desperately clawing at the wooden floorboards as if trying to physically dig a hole to escape my presence. Through my thermal vision, I saw the 2 bright orange heat signatures of his heavy enforcers rapidly approaching from the back room. "Tell them to leave, Kalen," I commanded softly, the heavy draconic distortion still thickly laced through my human vocal cords, "or I will physically tear this entire building down to the bedrock and aggressively consume everyone inside." The heavy wooden door at the back of the shop violently slammed open, revealing 2 massive, heavily scarred thugs wielding jagged iron clubs. "Boss, you rang?" The lead enforcer grunted, aggressively stepping into the room before instantly freezing in complete, paralyzing terror. The microdose of my aura hit the low-level thugs like a physical brick wall, completely stripping away their aggressive, combat-ready posturing. Kalen desperately raised his trembling hand, weakly waving at the 2 terrified enforcers while aggressively gasping for oxygen. "Get out!" Kalen shrieked, his voice completely devoid of any previous arrogance. "Get back in the storeroom and lock the damn door." The 2 thugs didn't hesitate for a single microsecond, instantly turning around and aggressively sprinting back into the dark hallway. The heavy wooden door violently slammed shut, followed immediately by the desperate, rapid scraping of a heavy iron barricade sliding into place. Once the immediate physical threat was completely neutralized, I instantly re-engaged the absolute compression of my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry. I flawlessly sealed the microscopic crack in my disguise, aggressively pulling the catastrophic draconic aura firmly back into my heavily compressed core. The suffocating, predatory pressure instantly vanished from the room, leaving the stale, heavily ozone-scented air feeling completely empty. The frost rapidly melted off the glass transaction counter, and the 40 wind attribute mana crystals instantly resumed their steady, pulsing emerald glow. Kalen remained violently curled on the floor for several long, agonizing seconds, desperately taking deep, shuddering gasps of the suddenly breathable air. He slowly dragged his trembling, sweat-soaked body back up the side of the wooden shelving unit, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. What in the name of the abyss are you? Kalen whimpered, his broken monocle dangling pathetically from a single gold chain on his silk doublet. I am a completely mundane, highly cooperative business partner. I lied flawlessly, my voice entirely returning to its deadpan, normal human pitch. Now, regarding the 4,000 gold coins for the 40 wind crystals we were currently negotiating. Kalen flinched violently, aggressively pushing himself completely upright and frantically rushing toward a heavily reinforced steel safe in the corner of the room. He rapidly spun the heavy brass tumblers, completely abandoning any pretense of bargaining or aggressive merchant negotiation tactics. I told you, I don't have that much physical gold on hand. Kalen stammered frantically as he aggressively yanked the heavy steel door open. But I have high-density imperial banknotes, fully backed by the Solene Central Treasury, directly redeemable at any major banking guild in the kingdom. That was actually a massive, unexpected logistical upgrade that perfectly solved my incredibly annoying physical storage problems. Imperial banknotes were heavily enchanted strips of alchemically treated vellum, magically watermarked to prevent highly illegal forgery. They carried absolutely zero physical weight, allowing massive pools of raw capital to be completely concealed within a standard leather wallet. I will accept the high-density currency, I confirmed coldly, resting my human hand directly next to the massive pile of glowing green crystals. Kalen frantically pulled a thick, heavily bound stack of pristine white vellum from the back of the steel safe, his hands violently shaking. He practically ran back to the iron-caged counter, aggressively shoving the thick stack of enchanted paper through the narrow transaction slot. For 1,000 gold, perfectly converted into 4,000 gold denomination imperial banknotes, Kalen gasped, desperately pushing the money toward my waiting hands. I picked up the heavy stack of alchemically treated vellum, instantly utilizing my gluttonous void eyes to actively scan the localized magic within the ink. The complex, highly intricate mana signatures woven into the paper were absolutely flawless, completely confirming that the massive payout was entirely genuine. Excellent, I muttered, smoothly sliding the massive fortune into a secure, hidden inner pocket of my stolen boiled leather tunic. Before I released the 40 highly illegal wind crystals to him, I recognized another glaring logistical vulnerability in my current equipment loadout. My remaining 7 wind crystals, along with my massive pile of physical gold, were still highly vulnerable to basic environmental damage. I also require a secure, non-magical chest pouch, I demanded, aggressively pointing at a high-quality leather harness hanging on the wall behind him. Something durable, heavily water-resistant, and entirely devoid of any localized spatial enchantments that might accidentally trigger a vanguard scrying ward. Kalen didn't argue, frantically pulling the heavy, dark leather chest pouch off the iron hook and aggressively shoving it through the slot. Take it. Take whatever you want, Kalen pleaded, completely broken by the overwhelming psychological trauma of my highly controlled aura leak. I accepted the durable leather rig, quickly strapping the secure chest pouch directly over my tunic and heavily adjusting the steel buckles. I systematically transferred my 7 remaining wind crystals from my lower back directly into the heavily padded compartments of the new chest rig. They fit perfectly, completely suppressing their passive magical radiation without heavily restricting my physical mobility in a combat scenario. Once I was fully equipped, I casually pushed the massive pile of 40 emerald gemstones directly across the scarred wooden counter. Kalen frantically swept the highly illegal ordnance into a heavily lead-lined lockbox, violently slamming the lid shut to kill the blinding green light. I turned around, fully prepared to immediately exit the heavily warded pawnshop and continue my aggressive resource optimization grind. "Wait," Kalen rasped, his voice barely a terrified whisper as he heavily leaned against the safety of his iron-caged counter. I stopped, slowly turning my human head to glare aggressively at the broken, heavily sweating black market fence. "If you're planning on moving more restricted magical ordnance through the city, you need to be incredibly careful right now," Kalen warned desperately. It was a completely unsolicited piece of high-level intelligence, a desperate offering made purely to ensure I didn't violently return to murder him. "Why?" I demanded, my tone perfectly sharp, actively demanding the immediate dissemination of the critical tactical information. "The Vanguard presence in the city just violently escalated 3 hours ago," Kalen explained, his bloodshot eye darting nervously toward his reinforced door. "Sir Gregory, the commander of the Northern Marches, just arrived at the upper keep with a massive detachment of heavy inquisitors." The sudden mention of Sir Gregory instantly triggered a massive spike of highly aggressive, analytical caution in my internal gamer logic. That was the exact same high-level commander I had completely humiliated in the Oakhaven Forest by violently stealing his family's enchanted claymore. He's completely furious, claiming a massive, catastrophe-rank draconic anomaly violently breached the mountain pass. Kalen continued, visibly shuddering at the word draconic. He brought a team of high-tier royal artificers to aggressively install a city-wide etheric resonance array directly onto the keep's highest tower. I immediately cross-referenced that specific terminology against my extensive MMO knowledge of high-level magical siege defenses. An etheric resonance array was a massive, highly aggressive radar system specifically designed to pulse a kingdom-wide detection wave. It wouldn't just passively scan for minor illusions. It would aggressively violently strip mine the ambient mana of the entire city looking for non-human cores. "When does the array go active?" I demanded, my internal threat assessment algorithms violently calculating the massive decrease in my available timeline. "The artificers are completely rushing the installation, skipping the standard safety protocols to meet Gregory's aggressive demands," Kalen answered rapidly. "My contacts in the upper ward say the massive scanning pulse will forcefully detonate across the entire city exactly at dawn." I quickly calculated the remaining time until the sun physically breached the jagged horizon of the surrounding mountain peaks. I had less than 6 hours before a massive, highly aggressive magical wave violently crashed into my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry. If the array detected even a microscopic fraction of my compressed draconic core, the entire Soline Vanguard would instantly descend on my location. The highly secure, zero-aggro stealth infiltration I had meticulously planned was now operating on a severely restricted, rapidly ticking countdown timer. "Thank you for the highly valuable intelligence, Kalen," I stated coldly, completely devoid of any actual gratitude. "If I ever discover that you shared the details of our transaction with anyone, I will return and finish what I started." I didn't wait for his pathetic, highly predictable verbal confirmation of absolute silence. I aggressively turned my back on the terrified smuggler and walked directly toward the massive, heavily warded oak door. I swiftly unlatched the heavy iron deadbolts, pulling the thick door open to reveal the freezing, smog-choked darkness of the narrow alleyway. I stepped confidently over the rusted iron threshold, letting the heavy door violently slam shut behind me, completely sealing Kalen in his miserable shop. The sharp, freezing wind of the squalid lower ward immediately bit into my fragile human skin, but I completely ignored the minor environmental discomfort. My internal priority queue had just been violently reorganized, heavily escalating my immediate need for high-level magical gear and defensive enchantments. I gently tapped the sleeping form of Squeaks within the heavy leather pouch on my belt, heavily relying on his continued silence. I securely adjusted the new, heavily padded non-magical chest pouch, ensuring my remaining 7 wind crystals were perfectly seated against my ribs. Deep inside my boiled leather tunic, the thick stack of 40 high-density imperial banknotes rested heavily against my rapidly calculating heart. I had the massive liquid capital necessary to completely dominate the local economy, but my window of execution was aggressively closing. I needed to immediately locate a high-tier blacksmith capable of crafting heavy, thermal-resistant mithril without asking any highly inconvenient questions. I activated my gluttonous void eyes once more, pushing the magical thermal overlay to its absolute maximum localized range. The dark, heavily polluted streets of the Solene frontier rapidly illuminated in a massive sea of glowing blue and orange data points. I merged seamlessly back into the dense, chaotic flow of the late-night pedestrian traffic, my mind heavily focused on surviving the impending dawn. The suffocating, heavily smog-choked air of the squalid lower ward suddenly tasted overwhelmingly of raw ozone and burnt copper. I immediately halted my calculated, deliberately exhausted civilian shuffle, forcing my highly compressed human muscles into a state of rigid immobility. Deep beneath the translucent dermal layer of my armpits, my physically concealed gluttonous void eyes aggressively flared to life. A massive, entirely unpredicted fluctuation in the localized ambient mana grid was violently sweeping across my 360-degree thermal vision. Miles away, the towering, jagged stone silhouette of the Solene frontier's highly fortified upper keep suddenly erupted with a blinding light. Kalen the smuggler had explicitly assured me the high-tier royal artificers wouldn't fully activate the etheric resonance array until dawn. My internal threat assessment algorithms instantly recognized the catastrophic reality of the rapidly escalating magical buildup currently painting the horizon. Sir Gregory was clearly operating on pure, unadulterated vengeance for his slaughtered men and stolen heirloom claymore. The furious Vanguard commander had completely bypassed all standard magical safety protocols, forcing an immediate, highly unstable early activation. A deafening, low-frequency arcane hum aggressively rattled the dilapidated cobblestones directly beneath my stolen, heavy leather marching boots. I utilized my void eyes to aggressively filter the ambient visual spectrum, zooming in on the keep's highest observation tower. A massive, highly concentrated ring of pure violet energy was rapidly expanding outward from the central spire like a localized shockwave. The etheric resonance array was forcefully discharging a kingdom-wide detection wave, specifically calibrated to violently strip-mine the city for non-human cores. The shimmering violet pulse rapidly descended from the wealthy upper districts, cascading over the slate rooftops with terrifying, unavoidable speed. I watched the aggressive magical wave effortlessly shatter a low-level anti-theft ward on a nearby bakery, completely ignoring the basic civilian enchantments. The sheer density of the incoming magical radiation was absolutely staggering, far exceeding the localized output of the checkpoint's aurasive. If that highly concentrated detection pulse directly struck my physical body in the open street, my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry would face immense pressure. The biological disguise was practically flawless, but the aggressive scanning wave would inevitably trigger an involuntary defensive thermal spike from my draconic core. My internal temperature would rapidly skyrocket, radiating a catastrophic heat signature that the array would instantly flag as a massive monster anomaly. I had exactly 12 seconds to completely remove my physical form from the open thoroughfare before the wave violently crashed into the lower ward. I instantly broke my stealth-oriented civilian pathing, aggressively pivoting my heavy boots and sprinting directly toward a pitch-black, narrow alleyway. The heavy, localized weight of the 4,994 gold coins tightly distributed throughout my boiled leather tunic brutally compressed against my ribcage. I expertly ignored the intense physical restriction, forcefully pumping my human legs to rapidly close the distance to the shadowy crevice. As I breached the threshold of the dark alley, I immediately activated my Tier 1 Shadow Glide ability. A localized drain on my mana reserves instantly registered in my internal UI as the dark, ambient shadows aggressively latched onto my physical form. The harsh, physical outlines of my stolen mercenary attire smoothly blurred, seamlessly merging with the suffocating darkness of the narrow corridor. Shadow Glide actively suppressed my external physical presence, significantly masking my visual footprint from standard human perception. But a basic Tier 1 stealth skill was completely insufficient to block the overwhelming, deep-penetrating radar of a massive siege-grade array. I needed immediate, highly dense physical shielding and a massive environmental heat sink to forcefully suppress my core temperature. The violet shockwave violently slammed into the squalid lower ward, instantly washing over the stone buildings at the entrance of my alley. The ambient air pressure aggressively spiked, making my fragile human eardrums painfully pop under the immense magical displacement. My gluttonous void eyes frantically mapped the confined alleyway, aggressively scanning the rotting brick walls and heavily polluted ground for a tactical advantage. A bright, freezing blue thermal anomaly suddenly pinged directly beneath a rusted iron grate set into the cracked cobblestones at my feet. It was a massive, heavily flooded subterranean sewer runoff, actively funneling a thick slurry of freezing snowmelt and toxic industrial waste. The freezing thermal mass of the underground water was exactly the environmental heat sink I desperately needed to mask my core. I rapidly dropped to my knees, perfectly ignoring the foul-smelling layer of rotting garbage and grease coating the alley floor. I firmly gripped the thick, heavily rusted iron bars of the heavy drainage grate with my bare human hands. Standard human musculature would have completely failed to budget the corroded metal, which was heavily fused to the surrounding masonry. I consciously bypassed my mundane limitations, engaging a highly controlled microscopic fraction of my compressed level 40 draconic strength. I carefully distributed the immense physical torque through my shoulders, aggressively prying the thick iron grate directly upward. The heavily rusted metal began to violently groan under the immense pressure, threatening to produce a loud, echoing screech. I instantly shifted my body weight, actively pressing my heavy leather boots against the opposing masonry to perfectly dampen the acoustic vibrations. The heavy iron grate silently popped free from its corroded housing, sliding upward into my waiting hands. I carefully set the massive metal covering onto the damp cobblestones, leaving a narrow, suffocatingly dark hole leading directly into the freezing depths. Above me, the violet glow of the etheric resonance array's pulse violently illuminated the thick smog blanketing the alley entrance. The aggressive magical wave was less than 30 feet away, rapidly chewing through the localized shadows of the squalid lower ward. I didn't hesitate for a single microsecond, instantly swinging my heavy legs over the edge and violently dropping into the subterranean runoff. The freezing, foul-smelling industrial water instantly engulfed my heavy leather marching boots and dark woolen trousers. The sheer, shocking intensity of the freezing snowmelt aggressively assaulted my fragile human nervous system, sending a massive spike of localized pain to my brain. The water level was dangerously high, rapidly rising past my waist and aggressively soaking the lower half of my boiled leather tunic. I reached up and flawlessly pulled the heavy iron grate back into its original position, seamlessly locking it perfectly flush with the masonry. I aggressively maintained my active shadow glide, letting the deep, subterranean darkness of the runoff tunnel completely swallow my physical form. The moment the freezing water made direct contact with my torso, my internal volcanic core aggressively flared to life in pure self-defense. My compressed draconic genetics instinctively attempted to generate a massive surge of localized thermal energy to violently boil away the freezing threat. If I allowed the massive fire attribute trait to fully activate, the resulting plume of superheated steam would instantly expose my position to the array. I furiously clamped down on my primal instincts, utilizing my sheer gamer willpower to brutally suppress the aggressive thermal generation. I deliberately forced my human pores to remain completely open, aggressively inviting the freezing, toxic water directly against my fragile skin. The intense, agonizing cold acted as a massive, continuous environmental heat sink, forcefully draining the excess thermal radiation from my suppressed core. My internal temperature metric violently fluctuated, caught in a brutal tug-of-war between my volcanic core and the freezing industrial waste. I carefully adjusted my posture within the cramped, circular stone pipe, ensuring the massive payload of 4,994 gold coins didn't drag me entirely under. I consciously kept my upper chest securely elevated above the freezing waterline, violently protecting my most critical liquid assets. The 40 high-density imperial banknotes heavily stashed inside my inner tunic pocket were magically watermarked, but I refused to risk prolonged physical submersion. Directly over my chest, the heavy, non-magical leather pouch securely housed my 7 remaining wind attribute mana crystals. The thick, heavily padded leather perfectly shielded the uncut emerald gemstones from the corrosive water and suppressed their passive magical radiation. Directly above my head, the violent, shimmering violet wave of the etheric resonance array finally swept directly over the iron grate. The localized magic violently probed the dark alleyway, sending thousands of microscopic arcane tendrils aggressively scraping against the wet cobblestones. I held my breath, perfectly freezing my physical movements as the array's dense magic washed over the rusted iron bars. The array easily penetrated the shallow earth, deeply probing the freezing subterranean water actively rushing past my submerged waist. The aggressive magic violently scraped against my Tier 1 humanoid mimicry, desperately hunting for the massive, catastrophic density of a dragon's core. But the freezing industrial slurry perfectly masked my fluctuating internal temperature, presenting the array with nothing but a localized mass of cold, heavily polluted water. The violet energy physically lingered over the grate for 3 agonizing seconds before smoothly continuing its rapid, destructive sweep across the district. I let out a microscopic, highly controlled exhalation, watching the dense magical wave rapidly fade into the distant smog. I had successfully bypassed the massive citywide pulse, but the immediate tactical danger was nowhere near over. A sudden, highly aggressive rhythmic vibration violently echoed through the thick stone walls of the subterranean runoff pipe. It was the distinct, perfectly synchronized sound of heavy, interlocking steel sabotants aggressively striking the damp cobblestones of the street above. My gluttonous void eyes instantly adjusted their localized focal length, projecting a flawless thermal overlay through the rusted iron grate above my head. A massive, heavily armored vanguard detachment was aggressively marching directly down the main thoroughfare, completely ignoring the surrounding civilian traffic. At the immediate forefront of the heavily armed platoon marched a towering, physically imposing figure radiating a massive, aggressive yellow thermal signature. I immediately recognized the thick, heavily etched masterwork plate armor and the massive, deeply scarred jawline of my primary human antagonist. It was Sir Gregory, the commander of the Northern Marches, and he looked absolutely consumed by a violent, unhinged fury. His dark eyes were bloodshot and completely wild, aggressively scanning the heavily shadowed alleyways with the frantic paranoia of a man seeking vengeance. The absolute humiliation of having his elite men slaughtered and his ancestral enchanted claymore violently stolen had completely shattered his aristocratic composure. I slowly shifted my head slightly, ensuring the deep shadows of my active shadow glide completely hid my pale human face from the grate. Sir Gregory was not aggressively gripping a standard vanguard halberd or a replacement broadsword. Cradled heavily in his thick, steel gauntlet hand was a highly intricate, aggressively pulsing piece of localized magical machinery. It was a military-grade etheric tracker, a massive, gold-rimmed magical compass specifically designed to synchronize with the keep's primary array. The heavy device consisted of 3 interlocking brass rings constantly spinning around a central, aggressively glowing crystal needle. The central needle was forged from a highly restricted lodestone of seeking, heavily tuned to aggressively point toward any localized residual anomalies flagged by the pulse. My void eyes effortlessly decoded the complex magical matrix powering the tracker, confirming my absolute worst-case scenario. The compass was aggressively feeding off the ambient feedback of the array, actively hunting for the specific microscopic arcane frequency of my draconic core. Sir Gregory aggressively slammed his steel boot into the cobblestones, suddenly halting his massive vanguard platoon directly in front of my alleyway. The towering commander violently raised his left gauntlet, signaling the dozens of heavily armored inquisitors to fan out in a strict defensive perimeter. The localized feedback is violently spiking, Gregory roared, his deep voice heavily distorted by raw, unmitigated rage. He aggressively tapped the thick glass face of the etheric tracker with his gauntlet thumb, his wild eyes locked onto the violently spinning needle. The array detected a massive, momentary thermal suppression directly in this grid sector right before the primary wave passed. Gregory barked to his men. The glowing crystal needle of the compass abruptly stopped spinning, slowly locking its trajectory directly toward the pitch-black mouth of my specific alley. My internal threat assessment algorithms instantly spiked into the critical red zone, aggressively calculating the rapidly closing distance of the hostile forces. Gregory wasn't relying purely on standard visual searches. He had a highly accurate, magically synchronized radar actively pointing directly at my physical location. If the Vanguard commander aggressively marched into the alley and pointed that compass down at the sewer grate, my stealth run was instantly terminated. I needed to immediately disrupt the localized magical frequency of the tracker before Gregory could zero in on my exact coordinates. Suddenly, a violent, highly erratic vibration erupted directly against my right hip, aggressively disrupting my flawless physical stillness. The heavy, brass-buttoned leather pouch securely strapped to my mercenary belt was frantically shaking against my soaked woolen trousers. Squeaks had completely awakened from his sugar-induced, moon moss coma. The violent shock of the freezing industrial water aggressively seeping through the reinforced leather seams had completely shattered the botanical sedative. Compounding the physical shock of the freezing temperature, the Level 8 Copperford Gopher was currently trapped directly beneath a massive, active Vanguard magical sweep. The overwhelming ambient pressure of the etheric tracker directly above us was absolutely terrifying the small subterranean monster. I felt Squeak's tiny, heavily panicked claws frantically digging into the wet leather lining, desperately trying to burrow away from the aggressive magic. If the terrified rodent let out a single, high-pitched squeal of panic, the highly trained Vanguard Inquisitors would instantly hear it echoing from the grate. I couldn't actively use my gourmand's digestion to synthesize another drop of sweet botanical resin. I explicitly needed both of my hands to maintain my current physical position against the current. More importantly, I critically needed the highly attuned sensory organs of the terrified Orat actively functioning right now. I forcefully clamped my right hand tightly over the outside of the wet leather pouch, aggressively suppressing the physical vibrations of his panic. I instantly routed a highly concentrated pulse of pure, commanding mental energy directly through our established companion link. I completely bypassed standard soothing tactics, aggressively asserting my absolute, terrifying dominance as an apex predator directly into his fragile mind. The system quietly pinged a small, translucent notification in my peripheral vision, confirming the aggressive psychological override. Companion command initiated. Copperford Gopher, Squeaks. Current loyalty, 57%. The modest 57% loyalty metric was just barely high enough to force the panicked rodent to momentarily prioritize my direct order over his absolute terror. Stop shaking and sniff, I mentally commanded, aggressively forcing the highly specific, non-verbal instruction into his primitive cognitive functions. Locate the absolute highest density of raw lead or heavy industrial metal in this immediate subterranean sector. Squeaks was biologically evolved to effortlessly detect dense concentrations of subterranean minerals through feet of solid bedrock. The terrified rat instantly froze inside the wet pouch, his primal survival instincts forcefully overridden by my heavy mental compulsion. I felt his tiny, highly sensitive pink nose aggressively twitching against the soaked leather lining, his specialized olfactory glands rapidly processing the environment. The squalid lower ward's subterranean runoff was an absolute labyrinth of forgotten industrial infrastructure, completely choked with centuries of discarded metal. Within 2 seconds, Squeaks violently shifted his small body weight entirely toward the back right corner of the confined leather pouch. His biological radar had successfully locked onto a massive, localized concentration of the exact specific element I requested. I instantly shifted my gluttonous void eyes deeper into the pitch-black, freezing tunnel, actively following the direct trajectory of Squeak's physical indication. Approximately 10 feet deeper into the flooded runoff, heavily obscured by thick layers of rotting algae and calcified grease, was a massive structural anomaly. It was an ancient, completely corroded 24-inch industrial water main physically bisecting the primary sewer tunnel. My void eyes effortlessly stripped away the layers of biological filth, actively analyzing the dense, highly stable elemental composition of the massive pipe. It was forged entirely from pure, unadulterated high-density lead, heavily stamped with the faded crest of an ancient, defunct plumbing guild. Lead was an incredibly dense, non-magical heavy metal that possessed highly effective, natural radiation-dampening properties. A solid, 2-foot-thick wall of pure lead would perfectly absorb and scatter the localized magical frequency actively leaking from my compressed core. I didn't waste a single fraction of a second, immediately releasing my grip on the rusted iron grate directly above my head. I aggressively pushed my human body backward into the freezing, waist-deep slurry, violently fighting against the heavy resistance of the rushing water. The massive payload of 4,994 gold coins tightly strapped across my torso acted like a heavy anchor, aggressively threatening to pull me completely under. I flawlessly maintained my active shadow glide, ensuring my physical movements through the dark water generated absolutely zero visual light reflection. Above me, I heard the heavy, highly aggressive crunch of Sir Gregory's steel sabotants violently stepping onto the cobblestones of the dark alleyway. The Vanguard commander was actively moving into the shadows, his glowing etheric tracker heavily leading him directly toward the iron drainage grate. I violently engaged my compressed level 40 strength, forcefully dragging my heavy, waterlogged boots through the thick sludge coating the bottom of the tunnel. I aggressively closed the 10-foot distance, violently wedging my physical body directly into the narrow, highly claustrophobic gap behind the massive lead pipe. The heavy, unyielding metal violently scraped against my back, aggressively compressing my physical frame against the cold masonry of the tunnel wall. The distributed stacks of physical gold coins heavily ground against my ribs, but the heavy boiled leather of my tunic completely muffled the metallic clinking. I forcefully pulled my knees tight against my chest, ensuring my entire physical profile was completely shielded behind the massive lead cylinder. The freezing, highly toxic water rushed aggressively around my hidden form, constantly threatening to break my rigid physical stability. I stared directly up at the rusted iron grate through the flawless thermal projection of my void eyes, watching the massive yellow signature of Sir Gregory loom over the opening. The heavily armored commander physically stopped directly above the grate, his massive steel boots mere inches from the rusted iron bars. The highly intricate, gold-rimmed etheric tracker was heavily clutched in his hand, its glowing crystal needle actively pointing directly down into the sewer. "The localized signal is right beneath us," Gregory growled, his heavily distorted voice echoing sharply down into the dark, freezing tunnel. He violently dropped to one knee, the heavy steel plating of his leg armor violently screeching against the damp cobblestones. Gregory aggressively aimed the magical compass directly through the gaps in the iron grate, forcefully attempting to lock onto my localized signature. But the massive 24-inch thick wall of solid industrial lead perfectly executed its natural, radiation-dampening properties. The dense heavy metal aggressively absorbed the localized magical ping of the etheric tracker, completely stopping the signal from reaching my concealed body. My suppressed draconic core was flawlessly shielded from the device's aggressive magical feedback loop. I watched with intense, highly calculated satisfaction as the complex magical matrix of the tracker completely destabilized. The aggressively glowing crystal needle suddenly jerked violently to the left, completely losing its synchronized lock on my masked frequency. It spun wildly in 3 rapid, highly erratic circles before abruptly stopping, pointing completely backward toward the wealthy upper keep. The dense, pulsating arcane light within the central crystal rapidly faded into a dull, lifeless gray, signaling a complete loss of localized tracking data. Sir Gregory violently slammed his steel gauntlet fist directly into the damp cobblestones, the sheer physical force of his rage cracking the stone. "Damn this unreliable royal garbage," Gregory roared, violently shaking the heavy magical compass as if physical blunt trauma could restart the intricate spell. The massive Vanguard commander aggressively stood back up, his massive, heavily scarred face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated frustration. A heavily armored vanguard lieutenant rushed into the alleyway, stopping at a strict position of attention directly behind his furious commander. "Sir, the array's secondary sweep is completing its rotation," the lieutenant reported rapidly, clearly terrified of Gregory's highly volatile emotional state. The localized anomaly completely vanished from the grid the moment the pulse passed over the squalid lower ward. Gregory heavily exhaled, a thick plume of white condensation violently escaping his lips in the freezing night air. He aggressively holstered the dead etheric tracker onto his heavy magnetic belt, completely abandoning the localized search pattern. "The massive beast is actively suppressing its core," Gregory sneered, his veteran tactical instincts rapidly analyzing the failure of his expensive equipment. "It must have utilized a localized environmental heat sink to completely mask its thermal signature from the array's primary radar." I silently praised the massive Vanguard commander's highly accurate deductive reasoning, perfectly content to let him remain on the wrong side of the lead pipe. "We are completely wasting our time probing these empty alleyways," Gregory barked, aggressively turning his back on the rusted iron grate. He violently pointed his heavy, steel-plated finger directly toward the heavily polluted eastern sector of the squalid lower ward. "Move the entire heavy platoon immediately toward the industrial slaughterhouses," Gregory commanded, his voice projecting massive, unquestionable authority over his men. "If that catastrophe-rank bastard is violently bleeding localized mana to mask its core, it will desperately need a massive volume of raw biological mass to sustain the suppression." The lieutenant immediately saluted, violently slamming his heavy gauntlet against his steel breastplate. "At once, Commander!" the lieutenant shouted, aggressively turning to rapidly relay the new marching orders to the waiting vanguard perimeter. Sir Gregory didn't spare a single backward glance toward the dark, heavily shadowed alleyway that perfectly concealed his ultimate prey. He aggressively marched back out onto the main thoroughfare, his heavy steel sabotants striking the cobblestones with strict, highly disciplined rhythm. I maintained my absolute, rigid physical silence, heavily utilizing my gluttonous void eyes to actively track the massive yellow thermal signatures. I meticulously watched the glowing heat profiles of the heavily armored platoon rapidly move away, turning a distant corner and completely leaving my localized grid sector. The heavy, synchronized marching of the Vanguard Inquisitors slowly faded into the ambient, chaotic noise of the distant industrial district. Despite the immediate visual clearance, my internal threat assessment algorithms firmly demanded an extended period of absolute physical immobilization. High-level Vanguard detachments frequently utilized delayed rogue scouts to aggressively observe cleared sectors for any premature hostile movement. I remained perfectly wedged directly behind the massive 24-inch lead pipe, allowing the freezing, toxic water to continuously rush around my waist. The intense, localized physical pain of the extreme cold heavily assaulted my human nervous system, but I ruthlessly compartmentalized the agonizing sensation. My internal volcanic core violently churned against its enforced suppression, desperate to forcefully inject massive thermal energy into my freezing human extremities. I aggressively maintained the brutal biological lockdown, keeping my core temperature perfectly submerged beneath the ambient baseline of the freezing slurry. I gently tapped my right index finger against the soaked leather pouch on my belt, actively transmitting a highly controlled pulse of positive physical reinforcement. Squeaks remained perfectly still, the level 8 Copperford gopher flawlessly executing the rigid physical discipline I had aggressively forced upon him. The system silently provided a small, translucent update confirming that his loyalty metric had not degraded despite the massive environmental trauma. I mentally reviewed the exact structural layout of the squalid lower ward, heavily cross-referencing my intended destination against Gregory's newly deployed patrol route. The massive Vanguard commander was aggressively shifting his primary focus entirely toward the eastern slaughterhouses, actively searching for a massive, ravenous draconic beast. He was completely unaware that the catastrophe-rank monster he so desperately sought was currently wearing a stolen mercenary tunic and carrying immense liquid capital. I had successfully bypassed the highly aggressive citywide magical array and flawlessly completely evaded the direct, localized pursuit of a level 32 Vanguard commander. I silently counted exactly 300 seconds, heavily ensuring that the localized grid sector was completely devoid of any lingering vanguard presence. The squalid lower ward was finally completely clear, leaving my immediate logistical path entirely unobstructed. I carefully disengaged my active shadow glide, halting the continuous mana drain and allowing my physical form to reassert its solid parameters. I slowly pushed my frozen human body completely away from the dense lead pipe, highly prepared to continue my ruthless progression path. I maintained absolute, rigid physical silence directly behind the massive lead pipe for another full 60 seconds to guarantee my immediate safety. The heavy, synchronized marching of Sir Gregory's vanguard platoon had completely faded into the distant, chaotic noise of the eastern industrial slaughterhouses. My gluttonous void eyes, still perfectly concealed beneath my armpits, continuously painted the localized subterranean tunnel in a flawless, 360-degree thermal overlay. The immediate grid sector was completely devoid of any lingering, aggressive yellow heat signatures that would indicate a delayed vanguard scout. I slowly disengaged my ironclad grip on the rusted heavy metal cylinder, allowing the freezing, highly toxic industrial slurry to heavily push against my waist. The intense environmental debuff of the freezing water had successfully masked my core temperature, but my fragile human skin was currently paying a massive physical toll. My completely soaked boiled leather mercenary tunic was heavily plastered to my ribs, aggressively trapping the freezing moisture directly against my disguised flesh. The massive payload of 4,994 tightly compressed gold coins heavily strapped across my torso felt like blocks of solid ice forcefully draining my stamina. I carefully waded forward through the thick, foul-smelling layer of subterranean grease, actively fighting the rushing current to reach the rusted iron access grate above. I reached up with my numb, freezing human fingers and seamlessly gripped the thick, corroded iron bars of the heavy drainage cover. Engaging a microscopic, highly regulated fraction of my compressed level 40 draconic strength, I silently hoisted the heavy metal grate completely out of its housing. I smoothly pulled my waterlogged physical frame entirely out of the freezing sewer, aggressively hauling myself back onto the damp cobblestones of the dark alleyway. I quickly slid the heavy iron grate flawlessly back into its original position, perfectly ensuring it didn't generate a single metallic scrape against the masonry. The sharp, freezing night wind of the squalid lower ward immediately bit into my soaked clothing, aggressively compounding the massive thermal debuff on my human body. I needed to immediately neutralize the intense physical cold before my internal volcanic core aggressively flared up and completely shattered my thermal stealth. I heavily concentrated my focus inward, manually overriding the aggressive, highly volatile natural suppression I had placed on my primary fire attribute trait. I carefully allowed a microscopic, highly localized trickle of pure thermal energy to slowly bleed into the heavily compressed blood vessels of my human chest. The faint, localized internal heat instantly radiated outward, rapidly evaporating the freezing moisture trapped beneath my heavy boiled leather tunic without generating a visible steam plume. I meticulously routed the minimal thermal current down my freezing legs, actively drying my soaked woolen trousers and heavy leather marching boots from the inside out. Within 10 seconds, my immediate physical discomfort was completely neutralized, successfully returning my internal body temperature to a perfectly mundane, undetectable human baseline. I instantly tapped the brass-buttoned leather pouch securely strapped to my mercenary belt, checking on the current status of my heavily traumatized companion. The level 8 copper-furred gopher was violently shivering inside the wet leather confines, his small body severely impacted by the freezing subterranean water. I quickly routed a tiny fraction of my active thermal mana directly into my right palm, heavily pressing my warm hand against the soaked leather pouch. The localized, comforting heat rapidly permeated the thick material, completely stopping Squeak's violent shivering as the small monster eagerly pressed himself against the warmth. My system UI quickly flashed a small, translucent notification in my peripheral vision, actively confirming my successful companion management strategy. Companion status updated. Copper-furred gopher. Squeak's physical thermal debuff neutralized. Loyalty metric heavily stabilized at exactly 57%. "Listen closely, you pathetic little radar dish," I muttered softly, aggressively projecting my absolute mental authority directly into the rodent's primitive consciousness. "I need you to actively recalibrate your highly specialized subterranean sensory organs to actively hunt for dense, volatile alchemical reagents." I completely lacked the raw physical DPS required to aggressively confront Sir Gregory and his heavily armored vanguard platoon in my current state. The raw gamer math was entirely unforgiving. Fighting a level 32 elite commander and dozens of level 15 inquisitors simultaneously was a guaranteed game over. I needed to instantly convert a massive portion of my newly acquired liquid capital directly into consumable, high-density stats to permanently upgrade my combat potential. Squeaks let out a soft, highly compliant chirp from inside the warm pouch, his tiny pink nose actively twitching as he processed my complex command. The small monster possessed heavily evolved olfactory glands capable of detecting raw, highly concentrated magical elements buried beneath layers of solid bedrock. Within seconds, I felt Squeaks violently shift his small body weight, aggressively pointing his nose directly toward the northern border of the squalid lower ward. I immediately adjusted my physical trajectory to perfectly match his internal compass, rapidly merging back into the dense, chaotic flow of the localized street traffic. I flawlessly maintained my exhausted, highly subservient civilian pathing, perfectly blending into the miserable throngs of off-duty laborers and heavily intoxicated mercenaries. The heavy, distributed weight of the 4,994 gold coins physically strapped to my torso provided a constant, highly comforting reminder of my immense purchasing power. Against my ribs, the new, heavily padded non-magical chest pouch securely masked the passive magical radiation of my 7 remaining wind attribute mana crystals. Deep inside the hidden inner pocket of my leather tunic, the stack of 40 high-density imperial banknotes rested securely against my chest. I actively utilized my physically concealed gluttonous void eyes to aggressively scan the winding, smog-choked alleyways for any lingering Vanguard scout patrols. Squeak's biological radar flawlessly guided me away from the dilapidated slums, slowly transitioning my path toward the significantly cleaner mercantile border district. The rotting wooden tenements were rapidly replaced by sturdy, heavily reinforced stone storefronts boasting thick glass windows and highly expensive magical luminorbs. The ambient pedestrian traffic heavily thinned out, forcing me to aggressively optimize my stealth pathing to avoid remaining in the direct illumination of the street lamps. Squeaks suddenly let out a sharp, highly urgent mental ping through our companion link, aggressively signaling that we had successfully reached our exact target coordinates. I casually stopped in the dense shadow of a massive stone archway, actively focusing my void eyes on the specific building directly across the cobblestone street. The structure was a towering, 3-story establishment constructed from tightly fitted, dark crimson brick and heavily reinforced with polished black iron structural brackets. A massive, highly ornate wrought iron sign hung directly over the heavy oak door, heavily depicting a bubbling, violently glowing cauldron. The system's passive identification UI instantly translated the elegant golden script heavily etched into the sign. The Crimson Cauldron Apothecary. I aggressively tuned the magical overlay of my void eyes, meticulously scanning the dense, highly expensive defensive wards completely coating the crimson brick facade. The building was heavily protected by multiple layers of Tier 3 anti-theft matrices, specifically designed to violently repel localized spatial magic and lock-picking attempts. It was an incredibly high-end, heavily capitalized reagent shop, exactly the kind of premium vendor that routinely dealt in restricted, highly dangerous consumables. I casually stepped out of the shadows, heavily adjusting the posture of my stolen mercenary attire to project an air of quiet, lethal confidence. I needed to completely drop the pathetic civilian act. High-tier merchants only actively respected massive displays of aggressive wealth or overwhelming physical threat. I marched directly across the pristine cobblestone street, aggressively ignoring the judgmental glare of a heavily armed private security guard stationed nearby. I firmly gripped the polished brass handle of the apothecary's heavy oak door, smoothly pushing the massive barricade inward without breaking my aggressive stride. A delicate, highly tuned silver bell violently chimed directly above my head, aggressively announcing my physical entry into the heavily warded establishment. The ambient air inside the shop immediately assaulted my newly formed human olfactory senses with a massive, overwhelmingly dense wall of highly concentrated aromas. The heavy scent of crushed sulfur, boiling quicksilver, and intensely spicy, exotic botanical resins aggressively fought for dominance within the confined space. The walls were completely lined from floor to ceiling with massive, heavily reinforced mahogany shelving units groaning beneath the weight of thousands of glass vials. Countless bubbling, highly volatile liquids cast a chaotic, multicolored neon glow across the highly polished black marble floorboards. Standing directly behind a massive, heavily reinforced glass display counter was the proprietor of the highly expensive establishment. He was an older, highly distinguished human male wearing immaculate, heavily embroidered crimson silk robes trimmed with expensive, highly restrictive silver runic thread. A pair of thick, heavily enchanted magnification goggles rested securely against his receding hairline, pulsing with a faint, highly analytic blue light. My gluttonous void eyes instantly locked onto his massive thermal signature, rapidly analyzing the localized flow of mana actively circulating through his physical core. The system seamlessly generated his threat assessment data, aggressively projecting the text directly into my visual cortex. Alchemist Ronald, level 24 Master Reagent Crafter. He completely outleveled Kalen the Smuggler, possessing a highly refined, aggressively dense mana core strictly dedicated to localized elemental transmutation. Ronald slowly looked up from a heavy brass mortar and pestle, his sharp, highly judgmental green eyes aggressively raking over my current physical appearance. I was currently wearing a stolen, heavily scuffed boiled leather mercenary tunic that was still faintly damp and completely covered in localized sewer grime. My dark human hair was violently unkempt, and my heavy marching boots were actively tracking microscopic traces of toxic lower ward mud onto his pristine marble floor. Ronald's face instantly contorted into a mask of absolute, highly aggressive aristocratic disgust, his upper lip violently curling in pure merchant disdain. This establishment does not aggressively cater to low-level street scavengers or lost mercenary camp boys, Ronald stated coldly, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. I strongly suggest you immediately exit my shop before I actively trigger the localized defensive wards to violently throw you into the street. I didn't waste a single syllable on a defensive, highly pathetic verbal argument, completely ignoring his aggressive, low-tier NPC posturing. I confidently marched directly up to the reinforced glass display counter, my heavy boots loudly echoing against the pristine marble with aggressive, territorial dominance. I smoothly reached directly into the hidden inner pocket of my damp leather tunic, firmly grasping the thick stack of exactly 40 imperial banknotes. I aggressively pulled the massive fortune of localized capital out of my jacket, completely exposing the highly intricate, magically watermarked vellum to the ambient light. With a highly calculated, aggressive flick of my human wrist, I violently slammed the entire stack of enchanted banknotes directly onto the glass counter. The heavy, incredibly dense slap of massive liquid wealth violently echoed through the quiet apothecary, instantly silencing the bubbling of the nearby cauldrons. Ronald's aggressive, highly judgmental glare instantly shattered, his eyes violently widening as they locked onto the undeniable royal crests stamped into the vellum. He was a level 24 master alchemist, meaning his highly trained merchant eyes instantly recognized the staggering value of the 400 gold denomination notes. For 1,000 gold coins in pure, highly liquid royal capital was aggressively resting directly under his aristocratic nose, completely overriding his previous disgust. "My apologies, esteemed sir," Ronald rapidly corrected, his tone violently shifting into a sickeningly sweet, highly subservient merchant cadence. The localized smog of the lower ward often aggressively obscures my initial judgment. How may the Crimson Cauldron serve your specific, highly refined needs today? I aggressively tapped my human index finger directly against the top of the massive stack of banknotes, demanding absolute, unmitigated attention. I require massive, highly concentrated elemental catalysts, completely bypassing standard low-tier healing potions, or localized mana restoratives, I stated coldly. I need exactly 3 high-grade Fire Drake elixirs, and 3 perfectly preserved Midnight Lotus roots. Ronald physically flinched at my highly specific, heavily volatile request, his greedy green eyes violently darting toward the heavy oak door. Those are incredibly dangerous, highly restricted raw materials, sir, Ronald whispered nervously, his merchant caution actively fighting his overwhelming greed. Fire Drake elixirs contain highly unstable, concentrated liquid magma meant strictly for advanced siegecrafters, and Midnight Lotus roots are heavily saturated with toxic shadow mana.